It was almost 100 years ago that the Shenandoah, a giant Navy airship, was launched and then broke apart during a thunderstorm over Ohio. 14 men actually died, but 29 survived. And prior to its crash, it was at JBLM. And in fact, it has a connection to our area in several ways. And here to share more ahead of its centennial is historian Feliks Banel. Thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Good to see you.
Yes, you too. Okay, so tell me about these giant airships. Were just an experiment, right, in the 20s?
Yeah, in the 20s and 30s. The main thing an airship gave you, the advantage it gave you over an airplane, was you could stay aloft for hours or days at a time. And when you wanted to know what was going on over the horizon, you needed, before radar existed, you needed to be able to kind of position yourself out over the water and see if there were any ships or planes coming in. So it's kind of a national defense thing.
Okay.
And it made sense because we had lots of helium gas here in the U.S. out of reserves in Texas, and these big ships floated around, and it seemed to make a lot of sense, other than these giant crashes that seem to happen all the time.
I know, and this airship in particular actually came to what's now JBLM a year before the crash. Is that correct?
Yeah, back in October of 1924, 40,000 people showed up at this right outside Tacoma. The ship came, tied up, and all these cars pulled into town. Babe Ruth was playing a baseball game that day in Tacoma. Nobody paid attention to the Babe. They all wanted to come see the big airship.
Really?
Because it was a big deal. This was in the early days of aviation. To have this giant 680-foot-long thing flying over Tacoma really got a lot of attention.
True, very spectacular. And tell me about this crash then. It happened in September of 1925, is that correct?
Almost exactly 100 years ago. And it was off on another national tour over Ohio, and a thunderstorm hit it and tore it into 3 pieces. The place where all the men were, most of the crew, fell to the ground, and those guys all died.
Oh,
the back half broke off and kind of sank down to the ground. The front half snapped off and actually floated higher. And it was just like a big chunk of a balloon with 6 guys on board. They had to essentially pilot it like a rudderless balloon for another 8 miles before they brought it close to the ground. They dropped a line, and a farmer came out of his house and tied the rope to a fence post.
No way.
And they were able to shimmy down the pole and then use a shotgun to poke holes in the helium bags and let the thing kind of settle down to earth. Really crazy that these guys survived as long as they did, that they made it. It was crazy.
I know, that isn't, so was it kind of like they're using it like a parachute almost, like down or how did that work?
Well, the big ship had all these different compartments of helium, and that front part had its own compartments of helium. So it was like a freestanding balloon, but with no way to direct it. So they're just letting the helium out to bring it down slowly to earth, and then drop that rope down so the farmer could grab it.
That's an incredible story. And so I want to talk about, too, the Seattle connection.
Yeah.
How does that come into play?
Well, on board when it crashed, and who was in that front section, who actually piloted it down to the ground, was a young guy named Roland G. Mayer. He grew up in Seattle. He went to the UW. He worked at Boeing briefly when the Boeing company was maybe a year or 2 old. But then he went back east and helped design the Shenandoah, helped pilot it, and then helped those 6 guys in that front section all survive when it crashed to the ground.
Wow, that connection is truly incredible.
He's involved, like, and when the Hindenburg crashed, he was part of the Hindenburg investigation. When the Hindenburg exploded in New Jersey, he was sort of Mr. Airship throughout the 20s and 30s, and nobody around here knows his history at all.
I know, I don't think I've heard of him before this story, and this is just incredible. I understand too that there are still some artifacts as well that are currently at JBLM, is that correct?
This is my favorite part of the story, because they built this 165-foot mast for all these airships to theoretically come and visit what's now JBLM. The Shenandoah came and visited and spent a day there. They never used the mast ever again. It stood for 10 years. They had a guy painting it and changing the light bulbs and taking care of it. They finally tore it down, but if you know where to look out on base, if you can get on base, there's big concrete footings from where the mast stood. And then if you use LiDAR...
So that's what we're seeing here,
right? Yeah, that's actually the footing there, because it was a big, tall, 165-foot tall structure with pipes in it with water and electricity and helium. But then they actually expanded it. They built a big track around the outside of it, and the track is invisible to the naked eye. But this is LiDAR, which is a kind of radar, and if you see where those arrows are, that's where they actually carved out like a dirt road that's invisible now, but with LiDAR, it's still there. If you could peel back the tall grass in this field near the runway at McCord Air Force Base, JBLM, you would see this track from almost 100 years ago that was never used. It's crazy. These stories are hidden all around us. That's the stuff that I'm fascinated by, and what we've been doing this podcast about, called Unsolved Histories, where there's some element still exists that if you dig into it, there's a really cool story that has some kind of a local connection often. So
yeah, and why did you, so this is going to be in one of your recent
It's an episode that just came out this week, yeah.
Okay, and why was this something, because of the connection, or how did you even stumble upon this story?
I love aviation history. I have a guy named Lee Corbin, who's a local researcher. He told me about this a few few years ago. We dug into it. We talked to people in Ohio where they're going to mark the centennial later this year. We talked to descendants of Roland Mayer. We try to pull together a lot of context and not just sort of tell a story from reading stuff off Wikipedia. We go really deep and get to the people involved. That's what I love. History for me is about how people dealt with adversity and how they got over things. Like this guy Roland Mayer piloting this thing to the ground and working with this technology that pretty much went away after the 1930s.
Yeah, and how long does it take you to get an episode like this together? Because like you said, you want to have these connections with people and hear their stories.
It takes forever. I should be paid. I should be paid way more for the work I put into these things. No, you have a 2-hour interview. You might use 5 minutes of the audio. One interview might be 10 minutes long. You might use all of it. It's sort of hit or miss, but you have to be an expert on something to then know what part of the story to tell. And so I love it though. It's fun work. So.
Yeah, and then these blimps or airships didn't last too long. Why was that? Was it because they weren't
they'd either
safe?
break apart in thunderstorms or explode when they landed in New Jersey. Because the German, like the Hindenburg ship, was filled with hydrogen gas, which is very flammable and explodes. Our airships were helium, but they broke apart in storms. These have things like the Goodyear blimp. That's the descendant of these airships from the 20s and 30s. A big rubber balloon filled with helium that you can kind of fly around at the Super Bowl and stuff. They're not being used for practical purpose so much anymore, but they're used as a sort of a gimmick, I guess.
Yeah, that's the thing. I feel like you don't see it all the time anymore.
No, not that practical.
But yeah, thank you so much for sharing this piece of history with us and the local connection. Just really, really interesting.
Thank you.
Yes. And you can hear even more about the Shenandoah on Feliks's podcast, like you just talked about, Unsolved Histories, and that episode just launched this week.